Hola a todos y bienvenidos. In this video, you're going to learn how to pronounce the sounds of the letter D in Spanish. But more importantly, you're going to learn why not focusing too much on the pronunciation of the letter D could end up to better improvements in your pronunciation. Now, I know that sounds a little strange. Let me explain. Now, the English language and the Spanish language treat vowels and consonants differently. In English, we have a lot of flexibility with vowels. Tomato, tomato, again, again, data, data, economics, economics. On top of that, major differences in accents throughout the English-speaking world happen mostly on vowels. So as an example, if we take the English word day, then I would say that with my Australian accent, day. But in the US, it would be day. In the UK, it'd be day. And in Scotland, it might be day. It's a great day today. But all of those English accents have the same consonant D. Right? The D is fairly consistent throughout the English-speaking world. Now for Spanish, this is the opposite. Major accent differences between countries happen on the consonants, like the double L, the Y, the C and the Z, the letter S, and the letter D. And of course, the vowels in Spanish are very consistent throughout the Spanish-speaking world. Now, since English and Spanish are so different in this regard, when English natives are learning Spanish, they tend to bring their vowel flexibility with them, as well as a focus on the rigidity of consonants, which can end up creating sounds that confuse Spanish natives. Now, I recently did a video talking about the most common pronunciation mistake that we hear, and this is introducing the schwa into your Spanish. Now, I'll leave a link to that video at the end of this one, so go and watch that video at the end if you haven't already, because it is an essential idea to understand to make sure your Spanish is clear and understandable. Now, one of the criticisms that I received from that video was about my own pronunciation of the Spanish D. Now, of course, I have to say that I am not a Spanish native, which means that I am not going to be flawless with my pronunciation. That said, first, as I highlighted earlier, we have some flexibility with the pronunciation of the letter D in Spanish. And secondly, when I listened back to my own Spanish in that video, I thought the D sounds were okay. Now, I wasn't going to worry about the criticism because I thought maybe it was a little harsh. But then I got another couple of comments on a few other videos that made me think, well, actually, maybe some students might be a little confused about the pronunciation of the letter D. So for that reason, I decided to make this video to clear things up. Now, I mentioned that we have some flexibility with the letter D in Spanish. In general, the D in Spanish has two allophones and an omission. Now, an allophone is when we have two sounds associated with the one letter. Now, in English, this happens with the letter P. So if we think about the P in pan and the P in span, they're actually different. The P in pan is aspirated, so we give a puff of air, pan, and the P in span is not aspirated. Now, nowhere in the English language does an aspirated and unaspirated P change the meaning of a word. This makes these two P sounds allophones. Now, for the Spanish D sounds, the two allophones are represented by this symbol in the International Phonetic Alphabet, known as a voiced plosive, and you will know this sound as the letter D in English. And then we have this symbol, which is known as a voiced fricative, and you will know this sound as the TH sound in the English word this. Now, in English, these sounds are generally not allophones. Now, I say generally because we're going to see a little bit about how different accents can come into this and affect it as well. Now, for the regions where these sounds aren't allophones in English, they will separate two different words. So we can hear these two sounds in words like den and then, as well as breed and breathe. Now, it's also important to note that the TH sounds in the words then and this are different to the TH sounds in thing or Thursday. Now, the difference is voicing. So with thing, we don't use our voice box, but with this and these and those, they're all voiced. We use our voice box to make these sounds. So this is the first point of confusion that I've seen, is that some students might think that the D in Spanish may need to be the unvoiced TH sound, but we definitely need to voice it in Spanish. Next, whenever a Spanish D comes after a break between words, an N or an L, we need to use the voiced plosive, just like the normal D are used to in English. So at the start of words in Spanish, we have dar, deber, decir. Now these Ds are all like the English D, that voiced plosive. Then we have after an N, so mandar, mundo, cuando, grande. Again, these are just like the English D, And then the same thing after an L. So we have caldo, aldea, espalda. Now for the other sound, the voiced fricative, this is like the TH in then. Now this occurs when a D is in the middle or the end of a word, not followed by an N or an L. So if we take this word, we have the two allophones in Spanish, dedo. Then we have comida, comida. And then ciudad, ciudad. Now for the majority of Spanish dialects, a second or third D in a word will sound like this voiced fricative sound. And for me, a really simple way to master this sound is to think of it actually as a really soft D. Now these two sounds are very close phonetically and they're made in a similar part of the mouth. And so to go from a voiced plosive to a voiced fricative, simply just hitting a D really softly without letting the air build up and then release will get you there. So as we go from D to the. Now at this stage, I want to put on my teacher hat and say that if you make a mistake here and you say a second or third D like a voiced plosive, it's really not a big deal. Now I put mistake in quotation marks because there are regional dialects where this will happen anyway. And the same thing happens in English. So for an Irish accent, we can find that the voiced fricative that occurs throughout most of the English-speaking world will become a voiced plosive throughout a large part of Ireland. So we can see this in the following sentence. What are they doing over there? What are they doing over there?
What are they doing over there?
Now it is difficult to call a sound shift like this a mistake if a major country or region is doing this at scale. Now this same thing happens with Colombian Spanish. If we refer to the Wikipedia page on the phonology of Colombian Spanish, we can see that we have that voiced consonants, B, D, and G, are often pronounced as stop consonants after and sometimes before any consonant, rather than the fricative or approximate that is characteristic of most other dialects. So if we take this Spanish word, then in most dialects this is going to be desde, desde, desde. But in Colombia, this would be pronounced desde. Or maybe the sound associated with the S could be aspirated or dropped. Desde or dede. So for example, he has been a friend since last year. Es un amigo desde el año pasado. Now this last example leads to the other major situation with Ds in Spanish, which doesn't just apply to Colombia, but we can also find this throughout the majority of the Spanish regions, and that is to omit the voiced fricative at the ends of words and often between vowels, particularly an O and an A. So for example, this word could be ciudad. This word could be verdad. Or with an ADO, this word could be cansado. Or this word could be hablado. Right? And then for certain combinations, we could even hear that this word could be todavía. Todavía. And this word could be puede. Puede. So as you can see, there is quite a lot of complexity when it comes to the pronunciation of the Spanish D. But with that complexity comes some flexibility. And just like an English native saying, hey, they need your help, as opposed to they need your help, this will almost never lead to confusion. Most English natives will understand exactly what this means, even if you say they need your help. So if you're in Mexico and you say desde with the two English-like Ds, most natives there may not even notice what you just did, but the ones that do might say, maybe you sound a little Colombian, which for me as a Spanish teacher is fantastic, right? Really not a big deal. In contrast, and this may be the most important point of this video, if chasing the voiced fricative ends up affecting the integrity of your Spanish vowels, then this could be a major problem for understanding, right? And I've seen this firsthand working closely with Spanish students trying to work on this sound. Right? I've seen students say, working on the voiced fricative in say this word, and they end up saying something like comida, or even comida, right? Now if you say this, a Spanish native might hear this, que mide, which means that measures, which has nothing to do with talking about food. So my recommendation first and foremost is always think about pronouncing your Spanish vowels as accurately as possible. Right? Then think about the Ds in Spanish at the start of words, after N's and after L's as exactly like the D you already know from English. Then for the other D's, you can try to say them like a D, but as softly as possible, in which case you'll end up producing a voiced fricative, or if you say it really softly, it might almost drop away, which is also okay too, todavía, right? Then your Spanish will sound clear and understandable to Spanish natives all throughout the Spanish-speaking world. And just make sure you aren't introducing that English schwa into your Spanish. And I recommend you watch this video here if you haven't already to make sure that your vowels are as accurate as they can possibly be.